we can have this lesson recorded for anybody who couldn't join us, or if you just want to experience the joy and beauty of Mr. Han and Mr. Ippolito over and over and over again on YouTube, you totally can. All right, so
interpretation.
All right, so today we're learning about the legacy of Abraham Lincoln. Very excited to share this with you, and also very excited that Mr. Han is going to be teaching you this Abraham Lincoln lesson today. Okay, so just as a reminder, make good choices online, which you always do, so I'll move on from there. Just some announcements and just some things to remember. Our essential question, our big idea for today: what is the legacy of Abraham Lincoln? In other words, how should Abraham Lincoln be remembered? Like, what are the big things about Abraham Lincoln's life, about his presidency, and why is he, I think this was like question 16 on the study guide. Why is it that so many historians regard Abraham Lincoln as the best president in American history? Like, what did he do to deserve that reputation? So we're going to try to figure that out. Next Monday, in 5 days from today, we have the Civil War unit exam. Once again, in case like people still keep asking me questions, they think I'm messing with them or like it's a joke or a trick or something, but it is true. The exam can only improve your grade. It is no risk. We encourage everybody to take it. It's going to take up probably 30 minutes of your life. It can improve your grade. It cannot lower your grade. And then we do have class. Just so you know, the district has declared that this Friday, because of the Memorial Day holiday, this Friday is a class day for English, for history, and for elective. So check with your English and elective teacher to find out what's going on in those classes. I can tell you that in this class, we're going to be doing an exam review. We're going to be going over everything from the unit exam review. And I'll just remind you, there are some students who are really relying on this unit exam to help improve their grade. There are some kids who have Ds that are trying to bump them up to Cs, and some students who have Cs who are trying to go up to Bs, Bs go up to As, and this exam can do it for you. So Mr. Han, and I know that there are some students who are like, you know what? I'm done. I'm thinking of other things. I'm already thinking of the summer, and every student's going to be different, and so we're going to respect that. But you will just also need to respect the fact that there are some kids who, like, this test is a big deal. So Mr. Han and I are going to treat it like a big deal for those students who are treating it like a big deal. And then additionally, we're going to have our final YouTube live exam review of the year Sunday evening at 8 p.m. So you don't want to miss that either. So there you go. Okay, we will post, like I said, we'll post the video summary later today right here. And Mr. Han, are you ready to share with us your thoughts on Abraham Lincoln?
All right. Yes, sir. Let's get to it. Excuse me. All right, so today we're going to be talking a little bit about Abraham Lincoln. As you can see from the title slide there's two pictures of him, one from his younger days of beardlessness, and then the one on the right is what I believe is when he was in the White House, where he had the full-on beard. Next slide, please, sir. So a little bit of background on Abraham Lincoln. He was born on February 12th in 1809 in the state of Kentucky. However, the Lincoln family, they moved early on. They moved to Indiana, where Abraham Lincoln was mostly raised. Lincoln actually entered politics in the state of Illinois. He was first elected into the Illinois state legislature in 1834 as a member of the Whig Party. Actually, if I remember reading correctly, Abraham Lincoln was the only only representative of the Whig Party in the state of Illinois at the time. Everybody else was either a Democrat or a Republican. So Abraham Lincoln did serve one term in the House of Representatives in Congress from 1847 to 1849. And then in 1856, he joined the Republican Party. And then in 1858, he ran for a seat in the Illinois seat in the Senate, the U.S. Senate, in 1858, but he didn't win. But it did help him out in the long run. We'll get into more of that in the next slide. Any questions, comments, or concerns about Abraham Lincoln's background?
I'm going to speak up just really quickly, Mr.
Yes,
Han,
sir.
and say you're right to say that Illinois politics has been dominated for years by the Democratic Party, but the Republican Party did not yet exist in 1834.
Oh gosh, God!
The Republican Party will be created in 1854 in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So.
My fault on that one, ladies and gentlemen. It's too early in the morning.
It's all
without
good.
Coffee.
I've been teaching history for 24 years, so I was able to fill in on that one. All right. Are you ready for the next slide, Mr. Hahn?
I saw that Emily had her hand raised. What's good,
Oh.
Emily?
Wait, do we have to is this on the test like that?
No, this is just background information
okay.
on Abraham Lincoln. I'm just giving y'all the background on him, paint the bigger picture on Abraham Lincoln before we get into the nitty-gritty details.
Okay, just making sure.
It might be, it might not. I don't know. We'll see what happens. Find out. Yeah.
And Emily, I will speak to that also, because Mr. Hahn actually in the last slide, he literally addresses. So how do we actually answer these questions in the study guide? So you will definitely get an answer to that.
Mm-hmm.
So this is all great background information on President Lincoln.
All right, next slide, please, sir. All right, so next we're going to be looking at the election of 1860. If we take a look-see here on the election map, you can see it was a four-way race in 1860. The four candidates are there at the bottom right, the color-coded. Each states are color-coded by who vote, where the electoral votes went. The numbers for each state, over each state, are the electoral votes that they had at the time. You can kind of see in the northern states, such as New York and Pennsylvania, they had a lot of electoral votes up there. And matter of fact, if you take a look-see at the bottom, at the southern states in the deep south, such as Texas and Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, the Carolinas, and Florida, all of those 10 states combined made 61 electoral votes. And you can see that the states up in the north, like New York and Pennsylvania, those two states combined, they had 62. So those two states, New York and Pennsylvania, already outnumbered the entirety of the South who had voted for the Southern Democrats. So this map sort of speaks to the population difference, because the number of electoral votes is proportional to the population of each state. And so you can definitely see it's this difference that we talked about a couple weeks earlier between the North and the South, how the North had more population. And you can see how this would tie into how the North won the Civil War, because they just had more people in the North in comparison to that of the South. Mr. Ippolito, did I miss anything on this map here that you wanted to cover down on?
You represented it perfectly. That's
Thank you, sir.
Exactly what I would have said.
Thank you, sir. Okay, next slide, please, sir. So a little bit more into the election of 1860. So Lincoln was a major Republican candidate for the election of 1860 after his failed 1858 Senate campaign. So during that campaign in 1858, Lincoln gave a lot of speeches, and he debated his opponent 7 times. Now, what was it? These speeches and debates gave Lincoln a lot of national exposure, because people really liked his oratory. People really liked the way that he talked about things and the way that he articulated about issues. And it was really, what was it? The debates were really popular. They drew crowds in the thousands, and they really had an atmosphere like a modern day boxing match, And these people would come in the droves just to watch these debates, and it was just a rip roaring good time. Lincoln campaigned as a moderate Republican. He opposed the expansion of slavery, but he did not oppose its abolition in the slave states. The Republican Party was formed as an anti-slavery political party. Under Lincoln's leadership, the Republicans ranged on the political spectrum as moderates, like Lincoln here, and to radical Republicans, Republicans, who were very vocal in their drive to abolish slavery in the United States. They were very outspoken about against the evils of slavery, and they wanted it gone from the U.S., and they were not afraid who heard them. So yeah. Like I said earlier, the election of 1860 was a 4-way race between the Republicans, who ran Abraham Lincoln. The Democratic Party actually had a bit of a split in this election because of the issue of popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty, of course, was the policy of letting the new incoming state into the Union vote on whether they be a free or a slave state. And the Northerners, they weren't all about that, but the Southern Democrats, they were all about popular sovereignty, and that was the big split that they had. During this election? So the Northern Democrats they ran Stephen Douglas, and the Southern Democrats, they ran John C. Breckinridge. And then, of course, we had a fourth party in the race as well, the Constitutional Union Party, who ran John Bell. So that split in the Democratic Party ended up being their demise because there were two candidates that split the vote instead of one candidate in which the entire Democratic Party can unite behind. So and remember, you needed to have the majority of the electoral votes, and if it splits between two candidates in the same party, it does nothing to help them. In addition to that, 10 of the southern states did not have Abraham Lincoln on their ballot. So those states in the South, they had no Republican presence, so therefore they did not even put Abraham Lincoln, the Republican or the Republican contender, on their ballots. Nevertheless, Lincoln won 40% of the popular vote. Well, it was a little bit like a little bit under 40%, to be quite honest. And he won the majority of the electoral votes, mostly from the northern states. And as we saw earlier in the bigger version of the election map, the electoral votes in the northern states, there were a lot more because there were just a lot more people up in the north in comparison to the south. And as a result, Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th president, the first Republican president of the United States of America. Any questions on the election of 1860? Yes? No? Maybe? Please?
You're doing great, Mr. Hahn.
All right. Thank you, sir. If we can move on to the next slide, please.
Oh.
Uh-oh. All right, there we go. So we're going to be talking about a few of the policies of Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. So many of President Lincoln's policies during the Civil War were implemented unilaterally. Now, in this particular case, unilaterally means that he did it without the approval of the other branches of government. A couple of examples here is that he distributed $2 million, which back in the day was a significant amount of money, still is today, to be quite honest. So he distributed $2 million from the U.S. Treasury in preparation for the war without the approval of Congress. If you remember the Constitution, only Congress has the ability or it has the authority to, appropriate funding, federal funding. Second, he implemented the first draft in U.S. history without a declaration of war. Now, remember that a draft is when the government mandates that every man, back in that time, every man between the ages of, I forget what draft age it was, but I think it was like 18 to like 40 at the time. They had to serve 3 years in the military. And remember, only Congress has the authority to declare war, and the president does not. He can ask for it, but he can't declare it himself. And then lastly, the last example here is that President Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during the war, leading to the arrest of many Confederate sympathizers in the North without a warrant. So habeas corpus is the requirement that you need to bring somebody who's been arrested or who's under arrest in front of a judge or to a courtroom. That's the due process of the law, guaranteed. Guaranteed by the Constitution, guaranteed by the judiciary. That you need, if you're under arrest, you need to have a trial. You need to know why you're under arrest. But by suspending habeas corpus, President Lincoln was able to arrest these Northerners who had sympathies to the South without a warrant and without sending them to a trial or having them see a judge. So a lot of his political opponents called President Lincoln a tyrant. You can see the political cartoon on the top right there. He's burning what looks to be the Constitution and all sorts of other documents that are held in high regard in the United States politically. So they called him a tyrant. They called him a king for violating the Constitution, for violating American civil liberties. But President Lincoln argued that his actions were not only constitutional, but necessary because of the emergency of the Civil War, because of the threat that the Confederacy had posed on the Union at the time. So, and then in the probable words of Abraham Lincoln, as you can see on the bottom right, what did he say? Hey, it's war, baby. What are you going to do? So, any questions on President Lincoln's policies during the Civil War? We're going to be going into a little bit more on them in a little bit as well.
Did he really say that quote?
Probably not,
Mr.
sir,
Hahn.
which is why it says probably at the bottom right after Abraham Lincoln. So he most likely didn't, but I felt it was very appropriate for the time.
Okay, I do like it.
Yes, sir. Thank
All
you.
right, next slide.
Next slide. All right, so next we're going to be talking about the Emancipation Proclamation. So at the beginning of the war, President Lincoln's primary objective for going into the war was to preserve the Union. Remember, it wasn't about ending slavery. He wanted to make sure that the country did not split apart, and he did, and not fracture, because he didn't want the country to fail. President Lincoln did not regard the Confederacy as a legitimate government, but more of a group of armed rebels that were in control of Union territory. So it wasn't more of it's a foreign country that broke away from us. It's more of President Lincoln thought of it more as those armed rebels are occupying Union territory. We need to go and drive them out. But as the war progressed, many abolitionists and religious leaders, they pressured President Lincoln to openly include the abolition of slavery as a war goal. President Lincoln did want to issue the proclamation earlier, but his advisors told him to wait and announce it after a big Union victory. Remember at this time, the war wasn't really going all that well for the Union. Remember Stonewall Jackson at the battle of Bull Run, and General George McClellan messing everything up from a couple of weeks ago. The war really wasn't going well for the Union. And if they had announced the Emancipation Proclamation at the time when they were losing, it kind of would have looked desperate to them. You know, they were desperate for any win they can get. But President Lincoln held fast, and he waited until they had a victory to announce the Emancipation Proclamation, which they did after the Union victory at the Battle of Antietam. 5 days after the battle, President Lincoln announced the Emancipation Proclamation, which permanently freed the slaves only in the territories controlled by the Confederacy and allowed African Americans to join the Union Army. I'm going to say this again because this part's really important. The Emancipation Proclamation permanently freed the slaves only in the territories controlled by the Confederacy and allowed African Americans to join the Union Army. Before the proclamation was announced, African Americans were not allowed to join. They were not allowed to fight. But then afterwards, they were, they volunteered in droves to fight. Units like the 54th, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, they were composed of former slaves and free African Americans in Massachusetts. They went down south to fight, and they did one very good job fighting the Confederacy in the South. The proclamation also did three very important things. First, it hurt the South economically by removing its labor force, by freeing their slaves. They lost their labor. Second, it helped the North militarily because it turned freed slaves into soldiers for the Union. Double whammy there. And then third, but not least, it ended the South's chances of being recognized by any foreign power, specifically Britain and France in Europe. This was done by describing the Civil War as a war to end slavery, which both Britain and France at the time had banned slavery already. So by recognizing and associating with a country that was built and based on slavery, well, that probably would not have done well politically for them in the stage of world politics. So, yeah. Alexa, you have a question.
So I was just gonna point something out that emancipate is one of our vocab words on the
Yes,
study
it
guide.
is. Emancipate means to, to set free, I believe. But I think we'll go into more details on that in a little bit. Any other questions on the Emancipation Proclamation? Yes? No? Maybe? Please?
Good stuff, Mr. Hahn.
Thank you, sir. All right, next slide, please, sir. So we're going to be talking about the 13th Amendment. 13th Amendment states that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall be duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So after being reelected in 1864, President Lincoln made passing an amendment to abolish slavery a top priority. Remember, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free the slaves in the border states. These were slave states that did not secede from the Union. These are the states of Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and Missouri. They still had slaves, but they did not secede from the Union. And then also, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free slaves in areas under occupation by the Union Army. These are the areas of Tennessee and parts of Louisiana that were conquered by Generals Grant and Sherman in the early part of the war. Also, the Emancipation Proclamation was more of a wartime military measure that may have that it was more of a wartime military measure enacted by executive order. And after the war, if the Emancipation Proclamation were to be sent to the Supreme Court for review, it could have been reversed by the Supreme Court and been seen as unconstitutional, and it could have been reversed. So that's also one of the reasons why President Lincoln wanted to pass an amendment to abolish slavery. So with both houses of Congress under Republican control, President Lincoln ran a very serious lobbying campaign to pass the amendment in the House of Representatives. Remember, in the House, that the representatives, the number of representatives in the House is relative to the population of the state, and there were still enough Democrats in the northern states that they would have prevented a 2/3 majority needed to pass an amendment in the House. So President Lincoln ordered his Secretary of State, William Seward, to go and get these votes from these Democrats by any means necessary. Now, what he did was he offered government jobs and campaign contributions, just general bribery all around, to any Democrat who was willing to vote yes on the 13th Amendment. There was a Republican representative by the name of Thaddeus Stevens. He stated that the greatest measure of the 19th century was passed by corruption, aided and abetted by the purest man in America. Now, this whole lobbying campaign and everything, this was very well depicted in the movie Lincoln, starring Daniel Day-Lewis, and I gotta say, it was very difficult for me to research this, because I have seen the movie, and I thought, okay, is that exactly what happened? And when I looked into it, it turns out it was kind of what happened. Yeah, they went around offering jobs and campaign contributions to Democrats to vote yes. So the 13th Amendment narrowly passed the House of Representatives with a two-thirds majority, 119 yeses to 56 noes. And yeah, I think that's it for the 13th Amendment. Any questions on the 13th Amendment? Comments or concerns as well? Yes, Alexa, or is that your hand raised from earlier? I believe that was your hand raised from earlier. All right. Janessa, yes, you have a question for us.
Are we going to be able to have access to these slideshows when we take our exam?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep, they'll all be there.
I think you can even use the video that we're going to make.
Yeah,
all right.
Sure.
Indeed. All right, next slide, please, sir. All right, so we're going to be talking about Reconstruction next. Reconstruction is the term used to describe the rebuilding of the South after the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln, we didn't really participate in Reconstruction all too much because, well, he was assassinated at the end of the war, but he did get an early start on it while the war was still, while the war was still ongoing. So before the war ended, President Lincoln was already working on how to reintegrate the South back into the Union. There was a Union general who had asked him how they were to treat Southerners in occupied territory during the war, and President Lincoln replied, quote, "Let him up easy. You know, he can't. We can't be going around punishing everybody because otherwise it's not going to be. They're just going to despise us, and we're going to be an occupying army. And these are our countrymen. Remember, these are still Americans, so we still have to treat them as such." In 1863, President Lincoln announced the Amnesty Proclamation, and this proclamation offered pardons to Confederates who had not held office in the South, and who had not mistreated Union prisoners of war. But then the condition on this pardon was that they had to swear an oath of loyalty to the United States. And then a part of this Amnesty Proclamation was the 10% rule. And this 10% rule stated that if 10% of the state's voters had signed the loyalty oaths, then the voters of that state would be allowed to form a new state government. Remember, at the time during the war, when the Union Army was going into the South and taking control of the territory, it was the military, it was the Union Army that was the ruling government in those territories. So by signing these loyalty oaths, by signing these loyalty oaths and having 10% of the population sign these loyalty oaths, they were allowed to form their own state governments at the time. President Lincoln's Reconstruction policies were met by opposition from both the Democrats and the Republicans. Actually, the Democrats they condemned the Reconstruction plan because it was enforced by the Union Army, and therefore these were state governments formed under threat by the Union Army. So it was not they did not think that these were legitimate governments. The Republicans they themselves thought that the 10% requirement and pretty much the entirety of the policy was too lenient. These Republicans, oh boy, they really wanted to punish the South for the Civil War. They really wanted to make it so that so that the South would never rebel again. They wanted to really punish them. So they thought this was not strong enough. They tried to pass a bill to that made it harder for the Southern states to vote again, but President Lincoln was not about that. Near the end of the war, President Lincoln was focused on rebuilding the nation as one rather than focusing on who to blame. There was in the same movie, Lincoln, with Daniel Day-Lewis, he's having a conversation with General Grant prior to the surrender at Appomattox. And he's quoted with saying, in the movie, President Lincoln says, "When peace comes, it mustn't be just hangings. You can't just go around punishing everybody. Otherwise, the entirety of the South is going to resent this treatment. They're going to hate us. They're going to see us as occupiers, and they're never going to be Americans again. So it's better to welcome them back with open arms rather than welcome them back and punish them for ever doing this in the first place, and so that they would never do this again." So, Reconstruction, ladies and gentlemen. Are there any questions about Reconstruction?
I'm just going to mention this really quickly, Mr. Hahn.
Yes, sir.
You talked about you don't want the losing side to feel punished. You don't want the losing side to feel, like they're being mistreated or resentful. And I think that is the mistake that the Allies made after. They're going to learn about this in 10th grade, but I think that was the mistake that the Allies made after World War I. Was they made Germany just feel so miserable. It's all your fault. You were to blame for World War I, and there was all that resentment and hatred, and it was sort of like this us against the world mentality in Germany after World War I, which I think helped set the stage in part for Hitler and the Nazi Party and ultimately World War II. So,
yes, sir.
Some historians say, maybe had we treated Germany nicer, like Abraham Lincoln wanted to treat the South nicer after they lost, perhaps you would not have seen the rise of Adolf Hitler. Maybe.
Yes, sir. Damien says history always repeats, just a little different each time. Oh man,
sure.
Ain't that the truth?
For
Ain't
sure.
That the truth? All right. So next we're going to be talking about President Lincoln's assassination. So on April 14th in 1864, Not even a week after Robert E. Lee had surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse, President Lincoln was attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. I believe the play was Our American Cousin. And while he was watching the play, he was shot by a well-known and very famous actor, John Wilkes Booth. Sir, I just lost the slides. Mr. Ippolito?
Sorry about that. That was my fault.
So he was shot while watching the play by a stage actor, the name John Wilkes Booth. The assassination was actually a part of a larger plot to revive the Confederate cause by assassinating President Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson, and Secretary of State William Seward. These conspirators, they believe that these three men were the most responsible of what happened to the South, what happened to the Confederacy, and by eliminating them, they would revive the Confederacy and continue fighting and eventually gain independence from the Union. Let's see here. So President Lincoln was, excuse me. Oh yeah, and also John Wilkes Booth was actually the only conspirator to succeed in his mission. The man tasked with assassinating Vice President Andrew Johnson, he actually chickened out and couldn't find the nerve to actually kill his, Vice President Johnson. And the man tasked with assassinating William Seward, he actually did succeed in stabbing him 5 times in the face and neck, but he failed to kill him. And the reason behind that was that William Seward, he had a horse riding accident the day before, I believe, and he fell off a horse and he had a metal brace around his neck to stabilize his neck, and he was in his room recovering, and the man who came to kill him burst into the room and tried to stab him. He did actually end up stabbing him in the face and the neck and a little bit, but he tried to go for the blood vessels in the neck here, but that metal brace that was around his neck did not prevented the knife from penetrating, so that actually did save his life. What was it? Emily Swift is asking, did no one have security for the president? There was security, but I am unsure of the details of what happened and how John Wilkes Booth was able to access the president's viewing box in the theater.
I can speak to that. I have been to Ford's Theater.
There we go. We have our subject
so
matter
exciting.
expert right here.
Yeah, so there was no such thing as Secret Service back then. Of course, today we take the security of the president far more seriously. Not only the president, but the president's family, presidential candidates. Joe Biden, for example, who is the presumptive Democratic nominee for, running for the Democrats in 2020. He already has Secret Service protection. So we take security much more seriously. Back then, the president had one guard from, I think it was the Pinkerton Detective Agency, who was standing guard. But you have to understand that John Wilkes Booth was the most famous actor in the United States. So imagine if an actor, think of a famous actor today. Think of, I don't know, Brad Pitt or Tom Cruise, or think of some enormously famous celebrity in the United States who just wants to go up and talk to the president, who just wants to go and hey, can I meet the president? Well, today we would barely even think that a celebrity, that a famous person, a famous actor, whatever, would actually have the nerve to do that. But that's exactly what happened. The most famous actor in the United States murdered the president of the United States. And basically the security was just like, oh yeah, go right ahead. Yeah, go see the president. So today, of course, we assume that everybody could potentially be a bad actor. And so everybody has to go through metal detectors before you meet the president. Everybody, has to go through security. But back then it was like, well, how would a beloved actor possibly kill the president? So that's the story behind the assassination.
Yes, indeed. I did see another question by Damien. Wasn't William Seward the one that bought Alaska? Yes, he was. That was later on. He did purchase Alaska from the Russians. And funny enough, one of Alaska's nicknames is Seward's Icebox. But moving on back to the assassination here. So President Lincoln, after he was shot, he was still alive, even though he was shot in the back of the head. He was still alive, and he was taken to a house across the street of the theater where doctors were called, and they tried to help him as best they could, but unfortunately they weren't able to. And President Lincoln died there the next morning. John Wilkes Booth and the other conspirators, they were all hunted down by the Union Army, and Booth himself was killed after he was surrounded, hiding out in a barn, on April the 26th in 1864. The other conspirators, they were all captured, and they were all found guilty during a military tribunal and were either hanged or sentenced to life in prison. Now, a military tribunal is a trial by military officers, and it's not like a civilian trial, like a civilian courtroom at all. It is completely different. So in a military tribunal, the jury, which is all military officers, Union Army officers, they only needed a majority or 50% for a guilty verdict. In a civilian trial, the verdict needs to be unanimous. Every member of the jury has to be on the same page in order to find somebody guilty in a civilian trial. In a military trial, not so much, only 50%. And then also in a military tribunal, the only way to appeal the verdict was going to be through the President of the United States. And Andrew Johnson was not in a very well forgiving mood at the time because, the assassination plot and all. So, so you can kind of see how this was kind of stacked. This whole tribunal was stacked against the conspirators. It was a trial by a jury of Union Army officers who had just gotten done fighting a civil war against the Confederacy, and who had just had their commander-in-chief assassinated by these men. And they were, so this trial is debated to this day about how it was pretty unfair against these gentlemen, and not these gentlemen, these conspirators. And so it was, it led to decisions later on down the line that, these civilians, we cannot try, later on down the line, where they determined that civilians cannot be tried by a military court. Only members of the military can. Another fact here from the military tribunal was that included in those hanged was a woman by the name of Mary Surratt. Mary Surratt, she ran the boarding house that the conspirators used to plot the assassinations. Of course, 5 out of the 9 judges of the tribunal, they asked President Johnson for leniency for Mrs. Surratt because she was a woman, but President Johnson refused, and she was hanged. She was found guilty of treason and hanged, and she was actually the first woman to be executed by the U.S. government. So any questions about the assassination? I don't see any questions in the chat.
And Sebastian.
And Sebastian, please and thank you.
Okay, so I've heard somewhere that John Wilkes Booth's body was never found. Is that a true statement, or was that just a rumor?
That is just a rumor. They found him, the Union Army found him hiding in a barn. I forget where exactly, sir, if you can shed light on that.
I want to say, well, it was either in Maryland or Virginia.
I think it was Maryland.
He escaped, so John Wilkes Booth escaped. He was on the run for, I want to say 13 days, 14 days.
Mm-hmm.
Finally found him, like you said. Well, so he tripped, right? He tripped as he was jumping off of the balcony. And John Wilkes Booth was a seasoned, experienced actor. And so he knows how to do pratfalls. Like you're trained as an actor, you know how to fall, right? And he was very athletic. And so normally that would have been just fine for him. except he was planning on making an escape on a horse. Well, what do you wear on your ankles if you are planning to ride a horse? Anybody know what you wear? And do you know what you wear?
I don't think so.
Emily Swift knows. Emily, what do you wear if you're going to ride a horse?
Spurs. It's like the thing on the cowboy boots that kick the horse.
Yes. So
Like jingle.
in order to, yeah, that's exactly right. So those cowboys, when they are, when they're walking and you hear that jingling sound, that is the sound of spurs, because you use the spurs to, they have kind of pointy spike wheels on there, and you use them to encourage the horse to go faster, right? So, so he had spurs on his feet, or on his ankles, right? On his shoes, and so one of the spurs got caught on the bunting of the presidential box. So I'm going to share this with you because Mr. Hahn, I've been hustling here. I need to exit, and then I need to re-present. So if I did this right, you're going to see a sideways picture. Let's see here. Did I do this right? Let's find out. Oh, there it is. Perfect.
All right.
Okay. So so this is the balcony booth that Abraham Lincoln was sitting in. So it was Mary Todd Lincoln right here, his wife, and then Abraham Lincoln right here. Over here was the Major Henry Rathbone, and his fiancee Clara. So Ulysses S. Grant had been invited. Ulysses S. Grant, of course, being the most famous general in the United States and the Union at that time. Mrs. Grant didn't like Mrs. Lincoln. And so Mrs. Grant basically said, okay, Ulysses, you do whatever you need to do to get out of this, because I don't want to go to the theater with that woman. And so he politely declined. Instead, Major Rathbone was here. He's another high-ranking official, not nearly as high-ranking in the Army as a general, of course, but he was invited to accompany the Lincolns with his fiancée. So John Wilkes Booth, he fires his gun, point blank range, right into the back of Lincoln's head. Lincoln did not have a chance. Major Rathbone finally realized it. Like, he snuck in real quietly. Major Rathbone finally realizes it, and he stands up to confront John Wilkes Booth. Well, John Wilkes Booth, it was a single shot Derringer pistol that he had, so he only had one bullet in there. So John Wilkes Booth pulls out a knife and slashes, gets into Major Rathbone's arm and slashes him to the bone. And so Major Rathbone is out of commission. He then jumps off, and his spurs catch on the bunting, and so he lands hard on one leg, and he breaks his leg. He shouts as he is running off the stage to go backstage. He shouts "Sic Semper Tyrannis," which is the state motto of Virginia, which means "thus always to tyrants," believing that Abraham Lincoln was a tyrant, that he was a king, that he was abusing his power. Oh my gosh, I could go on and on and on for days, but I should probably hold back, because I could talk about this all day. Okay, Mr. Hahn, back to you.
Thank you, sir. All righty.
Oh, and there's a sideways picture of me and my daughter Libby a few years ago at Ford's Theater. I don't know how it ended up sideways, but anyway, that's us at Ford's Theater.
All right. So I can see. Thank you, sir. I can see that some of y'all are wondering, what about the answers to the study guide? How is this going to come out on the test? Well, we got that for you right here. Well, we got number 15 for you right here. Next slide, please, sir. So number 15 on the study guide: how was Abraham Lincoln uniquely suited to be president of the United States during our nation's greatest challenge? What qualities did he possess that helped him guide our nation through the crisis and keep our country together? Well, number 15, here we are. This is what I think. This is what I think helped, that President Lincoln had, that helped us get through this Civil War and maintain the Union. So I think that President Lincoln was committed. President Lincoln used every power at his disposal to win the Civil War, and abolish slavery no matter the consequences to himself. Remember how we talked about how he distributed money from the treasury and enacted a draft without a declaration of war, and suspended habeas corpus, the Emancipation Proclamation. All of that he did unilaterally without consulting the other branches of government. And he knew that they were going to call him a tyrant. They were going to call him a king. They were going to call him, all sorts of terrible names because he's violating civil liberties and the Constitution. But he did it, but President Lincoln did it anyways without regard of what they might call him, because he thought it was necessary and he needed it. He needed to do this in order to win the Civil War and to abolish slavery. So he was very committed to the job. President Lincoln was also very compassionate. He worked to bring the Southern states back into the Union rather than punish them for trying to leave in the first place. Remember that the Republicans, they wanted to punish the South. They wanted to make sure that they would never rebel ever again. But President Lincoln, he was looking more to the future than in the now, because he wanted to bring them back because they were still Americans. They were still our countrymen. And by welcoming them back with open arms, that would have been a lot better to repair the ties between the North and the South than to punish them. Than to punish them for trying to leave in the first place. Also, during the war, President Lincoln spent a lot of his time pardoning deserters of the Union Army from their death sentences. Back in the day, if you deserted from the Union Army, they would hang you. And especially since it was a time of war, if you deserted the Union Army, they would hang you. But President Lincoln, ever the compassionate man, he read these he read the tribunal reports from the Union Army, and he pardoned a lot of these deserters from their death sentences. And you also have to remember, a lot of these Union soldiers, they were just boys as well, and they did not know about the horrors of war, and they saw it firsthand, and they did not want to partake anymore. So I really don't blame them at all. And lastly, we have President Lincoln was charismatic. That means he through his words and actions, he was able to rally the nation. He was able to rally the nation by appealing to its best ideals in pursuit of a more ideal, a more just, and a more enduring union. So he was able to unite the people of the nation behind the ideas of life, liberty, and equality for all, to make a better United States of America that would last longer in history. Any questions? Yes, Janessa, what do you have for us?
Is this question 14 on the study guide or 15?
This one is question 15.
15? Oh,
yes.
Because I'm reading it as question 14 on the study guide.
Uh-oh.
I'm guessing, Janessa, what may have happened is in your study guide, if you accidentally deleted a number previously, then it would have renumbered all of your questions.
No. Okay. Yeah, I see that.
But this is for sure the first of the two Abraham Lincoln questions.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you.
Not a problem. And the second Abraham Lincoln question, well, we actually did not write this one up on the slides. The question is, why do you think so many historians rank Lincoln as our nation's greatest president? I believe that's more of an open-ended question available for answer from y'all, the students. What do y'all think? Emily, what do you have for us?
So I have a question about this. Are we allowed to use the three, like committed, compassionate, or do we have to find other words on the answers?
That's a tough one, because I did make all these right here, I did make them up myself. But what do you think, sir? I'm open for them to use my reasons if they wish, as long as they reword it into their own words.
Yeah, for sure. And if we do have a short answer portion of the exam, most of it will be multiple choice, of course.
Mm-hmm.
If we do have a short answer portion, it would be like one question. And so that one question, it could be an Abraham Lincoln question. That is possible, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so definitely you should always, what would be really smart would be to say something like this. I believe President Lincoln had the 3 characteristics. As Mr. Hahn stated, he was committed, he was compassionate, he was charismatic, and then you describe those in your own words instead of just copying and pasting, because that would be plagiarism, and then that would not be good, and that would not only not earn you points, but Mr. Hahn would be very upset too.
Yes, I don't like plagiarism, especially if my work is stolen. So. Okay.
So Mr. Hahn, my wife, who has been listening in the other room, she was the one who was like sending me photos as we were going on. And so first of all, so I was able to fix the photo so that it was oriented correctly. And then, so this is after Abraham Lincoln was shot, and he's bleeding, and someone says, "Hey, is there a doctor in the house?" So there was a doctor that happened to be at the theater. There were several men. Remember, Lincoln is 6'4", so it took a few men to be able to carry him out of the theater across the street into what's called the Peterson House. It's a boarding house, kind of like what you might think of as a bed and breakfast today. It's a boarding house where people would stay for an extended period of time. This is the room where Lincoln died, and this is the bed right here. That is the bed. He was so tall that you can probably see it better here. This bed was not very big. He was so tall they had to lay him diagonally because his feet dangled off the bed because, again, he was 6'4". And so this is the actual bed where Abraham Lincoln died. So if you go to Ford's Theater, you can for one ticket, which is free, by the way, get to Washington, D.C. when this whole quarantine nonsense is lifted. And you can go and check it out, and it's awesome. There we go. Okay. Mr. Hahn, was there anything else that you wanted to share?
Not that I can think of, sir. I think we're good on this on my end.
All right. Scan the chat. I just want to make sure we didn't miss anybody. So if you can scan the chat, I'm just going to talk about this really quickly. Folks, we're in the home stretch. We have 4, like legit. Well, after today, we have 3 class sessions left. I'm kind of sad, but also excited too because we're finally bringing this this school year to a closure. Certainly not the way that we would hope, but we're gonna make it good anyway. Your homework now is to just go ahead and finish the rest of the study guide. We're going to go over, Mr. Hahn and I are going to go over the entire study guide on Friday. Remember, we have a regular class session from 10:30 to noon on Friday, so please join us. Friday is a regular class day because of the Memorial Day holiday, so you still have English, or you're supposed to have English, you still have history, you still have elective on Friday. So no office hours. Instead, we do have actual class this Friday from 10:30 to noon. So we're going to spend that entire 90-minute time period going over the complete study guide. And then a question, do I have to finish it by Friday? Oh, so Nathan, I would recommend you finish what you can finish. And then the things you're having trouble with, the things you're having trouble finding, go ahead and ask the question because we're going to be going over the entire study guide. Alexa, what's your question?
Sorry, voiceover was talking, so I couldn't hear you. Anyway, for the 90-minute periods on Friday, are you gonna record it, like
Yes.
part of it or something?
I'll record. Mr. Hahn and I are going to record the entire thing. So if you can make it, great, and if you can't, you can't. But either way, you'll be able to watch it later.
Mm-hmm. And we also have that YouTube live review on Sunday as well at 8 p.m.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
All right. Yeah, you're welcome. All right, Mr. Hahn, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stop the recording now because our class is officially